let's take a step back and get to the root of how this conflict ignited. To really understand, we've got to go back to 2014. That's when everything began to shift. Russia annexing Crimea was a major flashpoint. It wasn't just a territorial grab. It was symbolic of a larger, simmering tension between Ukraine and Russia, one that stems from their intertwined histories and differing visions of sovereignty.
Yeah, and it left everyone asking, what's next? Well, years later, we got the answer. By late 2021, Russian troops were amassing near Ukraine's borders, something like 190,000 soldiers strategically positioned. And that build-up quickly spiraled into action. Fast forward to February 24th, 2022, Vladimir Putin announces a special military operation. But let's not sugarcoat this, it was an outright invasion.
Exactly. It was a massive escalation, the largest military conflict Europe had seen since World War II. Russian forces advanced from the north, east, and south. Kiev, the capital, became an immediate target. But here's the thing. It didn't go as Russia probably planned. Ukrainian forces responded with astounding resilience. They set up defences, dug in, and held off initial assaults against all odds. It was remarkable to witness.
Yeah, they really stunned the world. I mean, who wasn't rooting for them, right? But before we dive any deeper into the strategies and battles, we've got to talk about the human toll. It's massive, devastating even. Over the span of this war, estimates of the death toll range from 172,000 to as high as 250,000 people. And that's not just soldiers.
Right. The civilian impact is staggering. Tens of thousands of innocent people caught in the crossfire. Take a number. 8 million. That's how many Ukrainians were internally displaced. Then add millions more, fleeing to other countries, creating the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. It's hard to grasp the scale of this tragedy.
But it's not just numbers, is it? It's people, families. Actually, let me share one story that stuck with me. And believe me, it's heartbreaking but also inspiring. In Mariupol, there was this Ukrainian grandmother. She sheltered her neighbours in her basement for weeks. No power, hardly any food, constant bombardment coming down on the city. But she refused to give up. She rationed crackers and water, made sure the children stayed busy with stories. I mean, can you imagine? When everything around her was collapsing, she held her community together. That's resilience if I've ever seen it.
It really captures the spirit of Ukrainians during this war, doesn't it? Amidst chaos and destruction, humanity survived. But of course, for every story like that, there are harrowing tales of loss. And unfortunately, the war is still raging, with no clear end in sight.
That story from Mariupol really captures resilience, but it also sets the stage for one of the most heart-rending chapters of this war. Let's dive deeper into Mariupol. Imagine this, a city under siege by Russian forces as early as March 2022. Months of relentless bombardment followed. Residential buildings, hospitals, even a maternity ward turned into targets. It was unimaginable devastation. And at the heart of it all stood the Azovstal steel plant, emerging as an enduring symbol of Ukrainian resistance.
Yeah, Azovstal, wasn't it described as like a fortress? Hundreds of Ukrainian troops and civilians took cover there. They held out for weeks, didn't they? Even when the odds were stacked against them.
Exactly. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from relief. And yet, they stayed defiant. When the last of them surrendered in May, it wasn't out of defeat. It was necessity. To this day, Mariupol stands as a devastating reminder of the stakes in this conflict, both its human cost and the lengths Ukrainians are willing to go to defend their land.
Speaking of defending their land, can we talk about Kharkiv? That counter-offensive, it wasn't just about holding ground, was it? Ukraine went on the attack and caught Russia off guard.
That's right. By September 2022, Ukrainian forces had launched a rapid defence of the oblast, retaking over 6,000 square kilometres in just a few weeks. It was bold, decisive, and strategic genius. This was fundamentally about disrupting Russian supply lines and logistics. And their use of drone technology, well, that redefined modern warfare, didn't it?
It really did. Bayraktar drones, you've heard of these, right? They became a game changer. Small, cheap compared to jets, but deadly accurate. It's kinda amazing how effective these were in the right hands. And Ukrainians even used satellite imagery to coordinate their attacks. You know, it's like war isn't just fought on the ground anymore, it's above it too.
Absolutely. Without technology like that, Ukraine's counter-offensives might never have gained the momentum they did. But let's not ignore the role everyday people played in this. Civilians became a crucial part of Ukraine's defence. In villages across the south and east, locals sabotaged Russian supply chains, gathered intelligence, and even risked their lives to guide Ukrainian troops.
That's inspiring. I mean, imagine how terrifying it must have been to spy on armed soldiers, just to pass back information. And yet, people stepped up. Even volunteer networks were springing into action, whether it was delivering first aid supplies, sharing evacuation routes, or funding new tech like Starlink internet connections to keep the country online. This whole thing feels like a national effort in every sense, doesn't it?
It does. And it's another reason why this war has drawn so much global attention. Finland and Sweden, for instance. They had stayed out of NATO for decades. But Russia's actions here, well, it pushed them to reconsider.
Oh, big time. I mean, Finland borders Russia directly, right? You can see why they'd want to join NATO. And Sweden, too. They realised neutrality no longer offered the security it once did. So, what happened? They applied. Fast. Like, unprecedented fast. And now Finland's already in, with Sweden not far behind.
And what an example it sets. Russian aggression didn't weaken NATO, it strengthened it. That alone shows how much the geopolitical landscape has shifted. Where NATO once felt Cold War era, it's now a vital deterrent against expanding authoritarianism.
It's ironic, isn't it? Russia tried to weaken European unity, and in doing so, they've arguably made it stronger. It's a twist no one saw coming.
No, they didn't. And as we look at these turning points, Mariupol, Kharkiv, NATO expansions, it's clear. The stakes of this war extend beyond Ukraine's borders. Every move made here casts ripples across the globe.
As we talk about the global repercussions of this war, one of the most striking areas to consider is its financial toll, on both sides. For Russia, the direct costs have already surpassed $450 billion, encompassing military expenses, sanctions, and the broader economic fallout. For Ukraine, the task ahead is just as daunting. Reconstruction alone might demand $750 billion, a staggering $750 billion to rebuild what this war has destroyed.
It's hard to even wrap your head around numbers like those. But it's not just about the money, is it? The economic side of this war is affecting global stability, supply chains, inflation, food security. It's hitting people everywhere.
Absolutely. And both nations are suffering massive economic contractions. Russia's been hit by unprecedented sanctions that are frankly reshaping their economy. Oil price caps, asset freezes, trade restrictions. This is a level of global economic isolation that hasn't been seen in decades. And yet, internally, they're managing to keep their economy afloat, partly because of partnerships with nations like Iran and China.
Right, but Ukraine's side of the story is so different. Their economy collapsed by around 30% in 2022 alone. And yet, the military and humanitarian support they've received is incredible. About $380 billion so far. Think about the scale of that. You've got countries like the US putting up $175 billion on their own.
Yes, and don't forget about NATO as a whole. The alliance has stepped up big time, providing everything from advanced weaponry to logistical and strategic assistance. The unity we're seeing here? It's remarkable. Many thought NATO was struggling to remain relevant, but this war has shown just how vital that alliance can still be.
And it's not just government stepping in either. You've got people around the world trying to help however they can. Actually, that reminds me, I've got a story to share. You'll love this. So, there's this Ukrainian-American family in Chicago. They heard about kids who'd had to flee without their parents, refugees, and without hesitation, they took these children in.
That's incredible. I mean, to open your home like that, knowing these kids might have lost everything, it really highlights the human side of this conflict.
And what's even more amazing, the kids are adjusting so quickly. They're learning English, making friends. It's like their lives are starting again in a completely foreign world. But at the same time, there's this deep connection back to Ukraine. They cook Ukrainian meals together. They follow the news every day. It's this beautiful mix of resilience and adaptation.
Stories like that show us how this war isn't just reshaping politics or economies. It's reshaping lives too. And for all the devastation, it's inspiring to see the kindness and compassion that's emerged as people step up to help.
It really is. And as we end this particular conversation, I think that's something to hold on to. Yeah, this conflict is overwhelming in its scale and its stakes. But at the heart of it, you find these incredible stories of humanity. And that's something worth celebrating.
It is. And as we wrap up today's discussion, let's remember this isn't just about Ukraine or Russia. It's about the choices we all face, the values we hold dear, and the future we're building together. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.